Alright, in this video we're going to take another look at the Dynamic Dyadic Model and how this model can provide us insights into current events. Here we'll be taking a look at the impact of social distancing and some implications of social distancing on our lives using this framework. Also, we're going to take a look at how this model can provide us with some insights into possibly improving our overall quality of life during this period, as well as even going forward after this period of social distancing ends. So recall that the dynamic dyadic model on the right is derived from another model, the PPF, or the production possibility frontier, on the left. Now that production possibility frontier, if you recall, allows us to calculate the gains from trade, and here we're not talking primarily about material gains from trade, we're talking about interpersonal gains from trade, or achieving a state of being which is impossible for you to achieve on your own except through exchanging with another. And so that's going to allow us to calculate the level of transcendence in that dyadic relationship. That's calculated by the level T in the dynamic dyadic model on the right. Now that level of transcendence is then going to be multiplied by the frequency of social exchange in that relationship to achieve a total transcendence of that relationship. And you can see as we change the level of delta, or the difference between the two individuals, represented by the horizontal axis of the dyadic model, we're going to increase the level of transcendence in that dyadic relationship, except multiply that by a smaller r, still achieving some level of total transcendence. Now, what the dynamic dyadic model assumes here is that the level of transcendence is maximized in that dyadic relationship. But to maximize the level of transcendence, we need to have a complete exchange between the two individuals. So, in a complete exchange, if you look at the sociology literature, particularly the work of Randall Collins, you'll see that there needs to be a high level of vulnerability between the two individuals, and primarily a bodily co-presence. In other words, a physical presence to achieve a high state of being between the two individuals. So, in other words, think about the times which you've had these complete exchanges with others. There's that high level of vulnerability, but you're also face to face, maybe in the dark or by candlelight, middle of the night, having a deep conversation with another individual, and you're really kind of emptying self and exchanging that with another to accomplish that complete exchange. So the dynamic dyadic model assumes a complete exchange. However, not all exchanges that we make with others are going to be at that level of magnitude. So there are multiple times, in case maybe majority of time, we have incomplete exchanges with others. Low vulnerability, low cost, and we're not making those high levels of maximizing transcendence. When that's done, you can see that the total transcendence is going to decrease in that relationship by that incomplete exchange. So what we can really kind of map out here on the right-hand side is all these different levels of total transcendence that's possible in a dyadic relationship, all the way up to the solid black line in which total transcendence is maximized by the bottom half of the PPF model, in which those exchanges are complete, highly vulnerable, usually involving bodily co-presence, all the way down on the DDM model, in which case there is no exchange, represented by the high left-hand portion of the PPF, in which there's no exchange at all occurring, and therefore no transcendence, but also no vulnerability involved. And so there's a difference in magnitude, continual distance in magnitude, that can be examined. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this and find out how social distancing is going to affect our lives. I want to pay particularly close attention here to the bottom in case of the PPF, in which those complete exchanges are going to provide that high level of transcendence in that dyadic relationship, represented by the upper half of the DDM model. Okay, so let's begin our scenario here. And let's first start off with core relationships, or a core relationships. Usually you have 2, 3, 4, 5 core relationships in your life. And let's assume that these relationships are different enough that we can go ahead and maximize total transcendence in that relationship. In other words, the delta here is optimized around friendship, and we could go ahead and maximize that total transcendence. However, what occurs in our life is that we're not engaging in those deep exchanges on a consistent basis. There's multiple reasons for that we don't engage in those deep exchanges. One of the reasons that we're going to take a look at in this analysis are all these peripheral relationships that we have. In our day and time, we busy ourselves so much, in part because this is the way that we're dealing with death and the terror of death, is if we busy ourselves so much, we don't have to think about the fact that we're going to die and that everything we do is going to come to an end and all the people that we love will die. We don't have to think about that horror. And so, in the case of traditional religion kind of decreasing its role in society, we've replaced that in part by busyness. So we don't have to think about the implications of that on our lives. We can just kind of ignore that by busying ourselves. And we do so a lot through these peripheral relationships. Also, what's affecting this is, for example, if you have kids, you'll find out that the relationship we have with our kids has fundamentally changed throughout the last 50, 100 years in particular. It used to be the case where the kids would follow the parents around. They used to be an economic benefit to the family unit. And so the kids would do chores, do tasks, help out around the house, around the farm, and the kids would simply follow the parents around during the daily routine. What's happened now is we fundamentally have switched those roles. So now, instead of the kids following the parents, it's the parents following the kids around into all these peripheral relationships. In other words, you've got to go to violin, then you've got to take them to swim lessons, then they got gymnastics, and they got soccer, and by the way, it's a traveling soccer team, so I've got to go out there and spend 3 hours at a tournament that for the entire weekend. And then back to violin, back to school, back to gymnastics, etc. So we're busying ourselves primarily with our kids, if you have them, in these peripheral relationships. And so what's happening is it's spreading us very, very thin. So we're not allowed to engage ourselves in those deep relationships or in those complete exchanges, those high levels of vulnerability, because we're jumping from relationship to relationship or exchange to exchange, and just kind of skimming the surface of a lot of these. So even though these relationships may be optimally designed to maximize our transcendence in our lives, we've got so many relationships that we are failing to maximize that total transcendence because we are engaging in suboptimal exchanges. And so we're setting this kind of up. There could be other reasons for this. We're just kind of telling this story and looking at how social distancing can affect our lives in this particular context. So let's go ahead and take a look at that now. So if I'm going to go ahead and examine social distancing and how that's going to affect our life, it's primarily going to affect the frequency of the social exchanges. So it's going to affect R. And it's primarily going to affect those peripheral relationships. In other words, it's going to decrease the exchanges I'm making in those peripheral relationships. Violin's been canceled. School's been canceled. Soccer's been canceled. So I'm not bringing my kids to all these other instances. And again, you can apply that to your own personal life if you don't have children. A lot of these other peripheral ways in which we're making exchanges are being cut, are being downsized and decreased. Restaurants are closing, gyms are closing, etc. So we can examine the impact of that by decreasing or rotating R down. So the social distancing is decreasing the frequency of our relationships in these peripheral avenues of life. And so we're no longer making those types of exchanges. Now, at first, the impact of this is that if I'm decreasing R, I'm going to have to be decreasing the transcendence of that relationship, or the total transcendence of those peripheral relationships. In this particular case, you can see that R has rotated all the way down, in which no exchanges are occurring in those peripheral relationships, in which case that total transcendence has decreased all the way to 0. So I'm no longer making those exchanges in my peripheral relationships, in my social network, because of the social distancing. So in this particular case, I've eliminated those relationships for the time being to socially distance myself. And so that's decreased my total transcendence. And this can be seen as a negative. In other words, the quality of life and society here has decreased because the total transcendence of our relationships has also decreased. And so this could be a case in which society overall has lowered its quality of life because our exchanges are decreasing. However, that's not the full story, because while we've eliminated these peripheral relationships for the time being, that frees up time to possibly focus on core relationships that we have that have not been optimized. And so recall that to optimize these core relationships involve making a complete exchange. And so what we can do during this time of social distancing is focusing on our core relationships and designing or purposely involving ourselves in these complete exchanges with those who are our core relationships. In this case, designing times of highly vulnerable times to have with those around us who are in core relationships. In other words, pull the core people around you aside, look them in the eye, and very slowly and deliberately tell them all the things that you assume that they know. Tell them how important they are to you. Tell them how much they mean to you. Tell them the qualities that they have that they may not know themselves. Take the time to speak those words into those core relationships. Design intimate moments in those relationships. Make dinner together instead of go out. And eat together, maybe in candlelight because the restaurants are closed. And then have a glass of wine or two and spend the next 4 hours talking till 3 a.m. like you did when you were first dating. If you have kids, read them books. Have a family reading time. Engage in a shared activity or a shared experience, a bonding time in which every member of the household shares, instead of these individual cases in which child A is doing soccer with parent A, or parent B is taking child B to gymnastics, or you're moving these kids around. If you're a single parent, from one place to the other place to the other place, now you've got some time to maybe implement a family game night that you can have a family wrestling time, a wrestling match. Engage in the hard physical play, the physical contact, and bond in those instances. Hug each other. Hug each other longer and tighter than you ever thought of hugging those core people around you. In other words, dive into those core relationships. Communicate, commit, be vulnerable, right? Make those complete exchanges with those core relationships. And what you can see happening here is that if that's done, and those core relationships are going to benefit from those complete exchanges, that can drastically improve the total transcendence of those relationships, even overcoming the loss of total transcendence of the peripheral relationships. In other words, the increase, because those core relationships are engaged in high quality exchanges or complete exchanges, the total transcendence in those relationships can even overcome the loss of transcendence from all that peripheral relationships that we were experiencing beforehand. And so maybe instead of looking at this time as a time of social distancing, what this dynamic dyadic model can illustrate here is that maybe perhaps that's a negative term, social distancing. That's like being anti-something. So instead of looking at it as a negative time, this model allows us to see that maybe what we should be doing during this time is not social distancing, but a personal reorienting of ourselves. So a personal reorienting time, or a personal refocusing time on those core relationships, to focus, to make those complete exchanges, to be highly vulnerable, to have that bodily co-presence, and to really engage and invest in those core relationships during this period of time. And maybe when we go back into quote unquote a regular life, maybe we don't pick up all those peripheral relationships again. Maybe we let some of those peripheral relationships go by the wayside, that we allow ourselves to then hold on to family game night, hold on to candlelight dinner, hold on to hugging each other tighter and longer, just a little bit more, and maybe our lives can then improve, not only during this period of personal reorienting, but also over the next year, over the next 5 years, as we reorient ourselves to maximizing those exchanges that we do make with the core people around us.